So this case study is going to be on Richard Callery, so let's just jump right in. A short case description is that this involves Richard Callery. He's a former chief medical examiner. It started off in July 2014, and it happened in the office of the medical examiner for the state of Delaware. We have a lovely picture of Richard Callery included here with a very grumpy face because of all the very bad things that he did. Let's get into some more detail. So for what and how, this case involves a large misuse of resources. Callery was moonlighting for his own personal side business, which interfered with the OCME, and there was mishandling of evidence in laboratories under Callery's control, specifically the drug laboratory. So Callery used equipment in the OCME office to perform testing for his side business and used some technicians under his command to help with his personal work as well, along with using other resources from the OCME, like his email account and things he had access to in that nature. Personal side business is really what plays a large role in all of the issues of this case. He took himself away from the duties at the OCME to make money for himself, creating conflicts of interest, issues with gray areas, and the evidence issues as well, which we're going to discuss next. So, the mishandling of evidence was the reason for this investigation into the drug laboratory. And as stated in a USA Today article, the investigation into the drug laboratory was started when a police officer opened an evidence bag in court that was meant to contain 64 Oxycontin pills and instead was holding 13 pills that were used to treat blood pressure issues. After this incident, the laboratory was shut down and held by state police. Callery was in charge of overseeing the lab, so this investigation led to an unpaid suspension for Callery and really brought up the investigation into him personally. And just for a little bit more context, the state police found 52 instances of drug evidence that had passed through the OCME that was either tampered with or taken, and this actually ended up to total around 700 cases by the end of their investigation, according to a Delaware Online article. So for why this was happening, these issues really occurred because of a need for financial gain and the presence of gray areas, along with a lack of accountability for Callery and his position. So Callery's side business, again, is the star of this part of my presentation. Having a side business was well within the right of Richard Callery, but it wasn't supposed to affect the integrity of his work at the OCME office or the integrity of the office itself. Callery's side business, spoiler alert, did take him away from his duties at the OCME, and to add some more context to the extent of his business, he made over $100,000 a year conducting side business for himself. So the same Delaware Online article revealed that in the course of a single month, Callery appeared to have sent more than 700 emails and attachments related to private work via his state email accounts. It also appeared that Callery served as a private expert in at least 7 cases that were handled by the OCME office, which was in violation of the state's prohibitions against conflicts of interest. And this area of his side business into the idea of gray areas. So when a forensic specialist runs a side business of their own, it creates a gray area, and according to the ethics and the practice of forensic science, gray areas occur when there is more than one right answer or method, and people must choose what is most right or most wrong in that particular situation. So since Callery was technically allowed to conduct his personal side business outside of the OCME office, the business was legitimate, but the fact that it affected the integrity of the OCME office and his work while under the employment there, he clearly was in a violation of his professional ethics, not because of the business itself, but because of how the business affected him and his work. This leads into the lack of accountability. So there was no accreditation at the time or quality assurance or control procedures. There is some instances of incompetence when it comes to Callery and his role in leadership that he had, and it also brings in the role of the Department of Health and Social Services, which I will get into a little bit more when we talk about the devil's advocate portion of this. We go into class connections. Callery's personal funds came from his side business, and as previously stated, he would take home over $100,000 a year. So his side business really was what brought him out to be unethical for the reason of personal gain. He wanted to do something that would financially benefit himself and not do anything for his professional work. And he intentionally started and sustained this business, which allowed for the other issues in the office to arise. So he was negligent to his duties, which caused other problems. So his gross negligence for his own personal gain makes this an even larger violation of professional ethics. And since he was the chief medical examiner, he was a superior in the office. And a conflict of interest is defined as a person exploiting their position or knowledge for personal gain or a person's abuse of authority, according to Module 12. So, pressuring his employees to complete outside work for him was abuse of his power and authority. And in addition to this abuse of power, Callery routinely worked on cases which had some connection to the Delaware OCME office. According to a USA Today article, he testified in a case as an expert witness to refute the report of one of his own employees, which is a clear conflict of interest because he was directly going against the work of his office. To play devil's advocate, Callery wasn't the person who was directly mishandling the drug evidence, but he took the fall because he was in charge of the laboratory. This brings us into a question of how accountable was Callery for these issues in the drug lab. Since he was technically the supervisor, there is some blame to put on him for not knowing what was happening, but does that make him compliant or was he just oblivious? If he was truly unaware of the issues in the drug lab, then it doesn't make him complacent or compliant, it makes him incompetent to oversee the laboratories. According to a Delaware.gov article, the OCME had another entity in charge of it above Callery. So the OCME was one of 12 divisions that made up the Department of Health and Social Services. And if the OCME was under this umbrella of DHSS, then why was no one at DHSS held accountable as well? Because if Callery is supposed to be checking up on his laboratories and things underneath him, why was the DHSS not checking up on him and their office while they were under their control? The OCME office was also not accredited at the time, so Mark Ekman reported that there was a report from Andrews International that examined ways to reform the office of the OCME, and this report apparently called for a more complete and thorough accreditation. So if without an accreditation process and the procedures that come along with being accredited, it possibly could not be Richard Callery's fault because maybe he wasn't aware of the actions that he should be taking, which brings us into quality assurance and quality control. So quality assurance is defined as a planned, systematic action that is necessary to demonstrate a laboratory's product or service meets specific requirements for quality. Quality control is the internal activities that are conducted according to externally established standards and used to monitor the quality of analytical data to ensure that it satisfies specified criteria. Both of these definitions were taken from a quality assurance, quality control PowerPoint from Professor Morose, but if quality control could have been employed to avoid the mishandling of the evidence in the drug laboratory, and then quality assurance would have been able to build a foundation for checks and balances to ensure that valid results would go along with a consistent chain of custody procedure, it could have alleviated the issues in the drug lab, which may have never even started the investigation into Richard Callery. Quality control and quality assurance would also have some say in what Richard Callery was doing in the laboratory and most likely wouldn't allow him to be doing personal work with state equipment. So since these procedures weren't in place, it's possible that he maybe wasn't aware that he wasn't allowed to be doing these things. So this slide brings me into the last thing you're going to need to listen to me talk about, and these are my class questions that I'm going to provide for you guys for the discussion. So, which is more of an unethical act? Working on the side for personal financial gain to the detriment of your office, or using state resources to complete your work? And do you believe that Richard Callery was at fault, or should the Department of Health and Social Services have been a part of that investigation? There's no report on the knowledge of DHSS, so if there was an investigation into their knowledge of the issues, then do you think that there would be someone at fault for having knowledge of the mishandling and misuse of evidence and resources, and or for not taking actions to end it or prevent it? And then what ways could QA and QC procedures may have helped in this case? And how do you think Richard Callery's behavior started? Did it seem like his actions were deliberate? And then would the situation been perceived as better or more ethical if it was just a small act that had snowballed into a larger issue rather than being something that was larger that just came to light in the sense of an investigation? And then last but not least, we have references on the last slide, and that's the end. Thanks for listening.